Freddie Owens walked into one of the worst ambushes of the entire Vietnam War and spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of watching young American soldiers die in the tall elephant grass of the Ia Drang Valley. And honestly, that kind of thing, it stays with you. It changes how you see everything. There's something about the way Freddie Owens talks about what happened in November of 1965 that gets under your skin. He doesn't dress it up. He doesn't make it pretty. He just tells you what it was like to be there when the killing started, and what it's been like ever since. You know, the men who were at Landing Zone Albany, they carry something the rest of us can't really understand. But if you sit down and listen to their stories, really listen, you start to get a sense of what they gave up, what they lost, and what they still hold on to all these years later. This is the story of Freddie Owens and Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. And I mean, there's a lot more to this than most people ever hear. Freddie Owens didn't go into Vietnam as some green recruit who'd never seen the inside of a barracks. No, by the time he shipped out in the summer of 1965, Owens had already put in 4 years of service. 4 full years. That's a lifetime in the Army when you're young. He'd been stationed over in Germany back when the Berlin Wall went up. You remember that, right? August of 1961, the Soviets and East Germans started stringing up barbed wire through the middle of Berlin, splitting families apart overnight. One day people could walk across the street to see their relatives, and the next day there was a wall of concrete and barbed wire and armed guards with orders to shoot anyone who tried to cross. Freddie Owens was there. He saw what that looked like. He understood what the Cold War actually meant when you were standing on the line watching it happen. That kind of experience, it shapes a man. It gives him a sense of what's at stake when nations go to war, hot or cold. And it gives him a certain steadiness that you can't really teach in basic training. You either have it from experience or you don't. After Germany, Freddie Owens found himself at Fort Benning, Georgia. Now, Fort Benning, that was the home of the infantry. That was where they turned boys into soldiers and where they trained the men who would become the backbone of the new air-mobile division the Army was building. See, the military was trying something brand new in the early 1960s. They were taking this concept of air mobility, of using helicopters not just for supply runs and medevacs, but for actual combat insertion and extraction. And they were building an entire division
on January
around it.
31st,
The whole thing started with the House Board back in
Vietnamese Lunar New Year
1962,
holidays.
when the Army convened a study group to figure out how helicopters could revolutionize ground warfare. The conclusion was that you could create units that moved by air
the presidential
the way cavalry units
General
used to move on
Westmoreland's
horseback,
and the American
fast,
Embassy.
flexible, able to strike
They
anywhere
occupied the
and
city
then
of Hue
disappear
for 24
before the enemy
days,
could respond.
and while there executed
The 11th Air
2,800
Assault Division
civilians
was
who
the test
supported the
unit,
South Vietnamese
and they
government.
ran exercise after exercise
And they
at
laid
Fort Stewart
siege
in
to the
Georgia
U.S. Marines
and other
at Khe Sanh.
locations to prove the concept could work. They practiced air assaults, helicopter insertions, rapid reinforcement, all of it. And the results were promising enough that the Army decided to go all in. In July of 1965, they took those lessons and stood up the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobility, at Fort Benning. The colors of the old 11th were cased, and the storied colors of the 1st Cavalry Division were unfurled over Doughboy Stadium, while the band played Gary Owen, the regimental march that had been the anthem of the 7th Cavalry since the days of George Armstrong Custer. The 1st Cavalry Division had a history going back to 1921. Had fought in the Pacific during World War II, had been in Korea from the beginning of that war to nearly the end. Now it was being reborn as something completely new. An air cavalry division with
Chi
over
Minh was
400
confident that the Viet
helicopters.
Minh would win the reunification
The soldiers would be
election
called
scheduled for
sky
that July.
troopers, and they would
Fearing the
ride
communists
into
would
battle
indeed
on
win,
Hueys
Diem,
instead
with
of
the approval of the
horses.
United States,
Freddie Owens
refused
was
to hold
right
those
there in the
elections.
middle of all that
And the Viet
transformation.
Minh saw no solution
And here's the
but a
thing that
military
made it
one.
personal
Thus,
for him.
the Second
He wasn't just a
and
soldier
American
waiting to ship
Indochina
out.
War began.
He was a trainer.
Gradually,
Owens
over the
helped
next
prepare
3 years,
many of the young men
down
who
from
would
the
go to
north,
Vietnam
down
with
the
him.
rugged Ho Chi
He
Minh
taught
Trail
them what
through
he knew.
Laos and Cambodia.
He drilled them on
flowed men,
tactics.
arms, and
He watched them
materiel
grow
for
from
communist
nervous
forces in the
recruits
South.
into something that resembled
Regrouped,
real
reorganized,
soldiers.
and rearmed,
Day
this
after
band of
day, he
guerrillas
worked
called
with
Viet
these
Cong,
young men,
slang for
correcting
Vietnamese
their
communists,
mistakes,
began
pushing
to
them
wage
to
a
be
war of
better, to
terrorism,
be sharper,
sabotage, and
to be ready
subversion
for
against
whatever
the
was
Diem
coming.
regime.
And because of that, because he had invested himself in their training, what happened next hit him harder than it might have otherwise. These weren't just names on a roster to Freddie Owens. These were his guys. He had watched them learn. He had corrected their mistakes. He had pushed them to be better. He knew their names, their faces, their quirks, their strengths and weaknesses. And now, he was going to war with them. That bond, that connection, it's a double-edged sword. It makes you fight harder for the men beside you, but it also makes every loss cut deeper. The 1st Cavalry Division didn't fly to Vietnam. They went the old way. They went by ship. In August of 1965, the division began loading up on military transport vessels at ports along the East Coast. It was a massive operation, one of the largest troop movements since World War II. We're talking about moving close to 16,000 men, over 400 helicopters, mountains of equipment and supplies. The logistics alone were staggering. The 2nd Brigade, which included the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 5th Cavalry and the 2nd Battalion of the 12th Cavalry, boarded the USNS Buckner. The 1st Brigade got on the USNS Geiger. The 3rd Brigade sailed on the USNS Maurice Rose. Division artillery went on the USNS Upshur. And the helicopters, those precious birds that made the whole airmobile concept work, they were loaded onto aircraft carriers like the USS Boxer and the USNS Croatan and the USNS Kula Gulf and the Card. The CH-47 Chinooks went on the Boxer, along with the big CH-54 Sky Crane helicopters. More than 470 aircraft in total, all of them needing to be protected during the sea voyage and then prepared for flight once they reached Vietnam. The voyage took about a month. 4 weeks at sea with nothing to do but train, wait, and think about what was coming. Freddie Owens remembers those weeks. The men ran physical training sessions on the open decks, doing push-ups and sit-ups and running in place to stay in shape. They attended classes on counterinsurgency, jungle warfare, patrol tactics, map reading, first aid. They learned about the enemy they would be facing, the Viet Cong guerrillas and the North Vietnamese Army regulars. They studied the terrain of South Vietnam, the jungles and rice paddies and mountains of the Central Highlands. They test-fired weapons off the back of the ships, zeroing their rifles and familiarizing themselves with the M16 that were replacing the older M14. The chief engineer on the Buckner even rigged up a floating target behind the ship so the men could practice marksmanship on the move. And they waited. A lot of waiting. The tension built as they got closer. The Pacific stretched on and on, endless water in every direction, and every day brought them closer to a war that none of them could fully imagine. On September 13, 1965, the division celebrated its 44th anniversary on the high seas. The next day, the 2nd Brigade arrived. When the USNS Buckner finally dropped anchor at Khe Sanh Harbor on September 14, 1965, the war became real. The men marched off the ship and onto Vietnamese soil for the first time. The heat hit them immediately. The humidity wrapped around them like a wet blanket. The smells were different. The sounds were different. Everything was different. The men loaded into helicopters for the first time on Vietnamese soil. They flew inland to a place called An Khe, deep in the Central Highlands, where the division was carving out a base camp in the middle of territory that had belonged to the Viet Cong for years. The 1st Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division had been securing the area for weeks, fighting off Viet Cong probes and clearing the route from the coast. Now the 1st Cavalry was taking over. That first night in Vietnam, nobody slept. Freddie Owens talks about that. The tension among the men was thick enough to cut. Every noise in the darkness seemed like it could be the enemy. Every shadow looked wrong. The jungle sounds were alien, unfamiliar. Animals called out in the night. Insects buzzed and chirped. Branches rustled. And the men sat in their positions, clutching their rifles, straining their eyes and ears, waiting for something to happen. These soldiers had trained together, shipped out together, and now they were sitting in the jungle together, waiting for something to happen. And Owens knew most of them. He had trained so many of them himself. That bond. It was supposed to be a strength. Unit cohesion, they call it. The trust that comes from knowing the men beside you, knowing their capabilities, knowing they'll have your back when things go bad. But Owens already understood that when the dying started, that same bond was going to make every loss cut deeper. Every casualty would be personal. The base camp at An Khe was named Camp Radcliffe, after Major Donald Radcliffe, the first 1st Cavalry Division soldier killed in Vietnam. Radcliffe had been the executive officer of the 1st Squadron, 9th Cavalry, and a member of the advance party that had come to Vietnam ahead of the main body to select a site for the base camp. On August 18, 1965, he was flying a gunship helicopter supporting an air assault when the landing zone came under enemy fire. Radcliffe immediately pinpointed the Viet Cong position and began providing suppressive fire to protect the troops coming in. The enemy concentrated their fire on his helicopter, and Radcliffe was mortally wounded at the controls. He was the first, but he wouldn't be the last. The camp was named in his honor, a reminder to everyone who served there of the cost of the mission they had undertaken. Camp Radcliffe sat in a valley in the shadow of Hon Kong Mountain, surrounded by the rugged hills of the Central Highlands. The location was chosen because the climate was good for helicopter operations, and because it provided a central position from which the division could project power throughout the region. The area they cleared for the helicopters was so flat and barren that the troops started calling it the golf course. The name stuck. Security was a constant concern. The perimeter was cleared to 100 meters, with obstacles and surveillance devices and artillery positioned to cover likely mortar sites. Patrols went out regularly to keep the enemy at a distance. But the Viet Cong probed the perimeter almost immediately. Mortar rounds would come screaming in at odd hours. You never knew when. Half a dozen rounds might land and then nothing for days. Then it would happen again. It was unsettling, Owens says. Those rounds would explode nearby, and you'd wonder if the next one had your name on it. But that was just harassment compared to what was coming. October and early November of 1965 saw the tension building across the Central Highlands. Intelligence reports indicated that entire regiments of North Vietnamese Army regulars had infiltrated into the area west of Pleiku. These weren't local Viet Cong guerrillas. These weren't part-time fighters who farmed by day and set booby traps by night. These were trained, disciplined soldiers who had marched down the Ho Chi Minh Trail for months, carrying weapons and supplies through Laos and Cambodia, specifically to engage American forces. The NVA had positioned the 32nd, 33rd, and 66th Regiments near the Chu Pong Massif, a massive mountain along the Cambodian border that straddled the frontier between South Vietnam and Cambodia. The Chu Pong was a perfect base for the enemy. The jungle was thick, the terrain was rugged, support lines from Cambodia were short, and the North Vietnamese could slip back across the border whenever the pressure got too intense. Their plan was to cut South Vietnam in half through the Central Highlands, to drive from the mountains to the coast and split the country in two. And the 1st Cavalry Division was sent to stop them. On October 19, 1965, the North Vietnamese attacked the Special Forces camp at Plei Mai, about 25 miles southwest of Pleiku. The camp was defended by a small number of American Green Berets and a larger force of Montagnard tribesmen who had been trained and equipped by the Special Forces. The NVA laid siege to the camp, surrounding it with troops and pounding it with mortars and recoilless rifles. The siege lasted over a week before ARVN forces, supported by American advisors and air power, managed to break through and relieve the camp. The 1st Cavalry Division provided critical support during the relief operation, with helicopters flying in supplies and evacuating wounded while ground forces fought their way down the road to Plei Mai. But that was just the opening act. The enemy hadn't been destroyed, only pushed back. General Westmoreland wanted the 1st Cavalry Division to pursue the withdrawing NVA and destroy them before they could escape to their sanctuaries in Cambodia. The pursuit led into the Ia Drang Valley, a remote, jungle-choked river valley at the base of the Chu Pong Mountain. Ia means river in the local Montagnard language. It was there, in that valley, that the full-scale war between American ground forces and the North Vietnamese Army truly began. Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry was commanded by Captain George Forrest. Now, George Forrest was a 27-year-old officer from Leonardtown, Maryland. He'd earned his commission through ROTC at Morgan State University in Baltimore, a historically black college, and he had been leading Alpha Company for about 3 months by November. Forrest was a calm, steady leader, the kind of officer who earned respect by how he handled himself under pressure. He didn't panic, he didn't yell. He assessed the situation, made a decision, and acted on it. That kind of leadership, it's not something you can fake. The men either trust you or they don't, and Forrest had earned their trust. Freddie Owens served under him. Owens trusted Captain Forrest. That trust would be tested in ways neither man could have imagined. The first major engagement came at Landing Zone X-Ray. On November 14, 1965, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, air assaulted into a small clearing at the base of the Chu Pong Massif. The landing zone was barely big enough for 8 helicopters at a time, which meant the battalion had to come in waves, each wave requiring about 30 minutes to complete. By the time the first wave touched down, the North Vietnamese were already moving. Within hours, the Americans were surrounded by thousands of NVA soldiers from the 66th and 33rd Regiments. The fighting at X-Ray was savage. It was hand-to-hand in places. The enemy attacked in waves, human waves sometimes, charging right into American machine gun fire. The Americans held on through artillery support, close airstrikes, and raw courage. They called Broken Arrow at one point, meaning an American unit was in danger of being overrun. It was the signal for every available aircraft in South Vietnam to converge on their position. Fighter jets, bombers, helicopter gunships, everything that could fly and shoot was sent to the Ia Drang. By the time the battle ended on November 16th, the 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry had killed over 800 confirmed enemy soldiers, with estimates suggesting the actual number was much higher. American casualties were also heavy, but the line held. Landing Zone X-Ray did not fall. Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, wasn't at X-ray on the first day. They were protecting convoys on the highway when word came that a unit was heavily engaged in the valley. George Forrest got orders to move. The company was flown in by Chinook helicopters, not the smaller Hueys that were standard for air assaults. Chinooks were cargo birds, meant for heavy lifts, not combat insertions. Forrest remembers thinking something was wrong from the start. Chinooks meant they needed to move a lot of people fast. It meant the situation was urgent. When Alpha 1 over 5 arrived at LZ X-ray on the second day of the battle, November 15th, they saw the grim results of the fighting so far. Freddie Owens describes it as an unbelievable scene of death and destruction. Bodies everywhere, American and North Vietnamese alike, some tangled together where they had died fighting hand to hand. The smell of cordite and blood thick in the humid air. The ground churned up by explosions, trees splintered by gunfire, the wounded being loaded onto helicopters as fast as the birds could land, and the sound of gunfire still crackling in the distance. The battle wasn't over. It was still going on, and now Alpha 1 5th was part of it. For the next couple of days, the men of Alpha 1 over 5 helped reinforce the exhausted troops at X-ray. They held the perimeter. They repelled probing attacks. They watched the B-52 bombers from Guam drop their payloads on the slopes of Chu Pong, massive explosions that shook the earth even from miles away. Those B-52 strikes were something new in warfare. Strategic bombers being used for tactical support, dropping 200 tons of 500-pound bombs on enemy positions just a few miles from friendly troops. The ground shook, the jungle disintegrated, and everyone hoped the enemy was buried underneath all that destruction. By November 16th, with the arrival of additional reinforcements, the situation at X-ray was stabilizing. The NVA had taken horrific casualties and was beginning to pull back. But the war wasn't over. It was just shifting. On the morning of November 17, 1965, the men at Landing Zone X-ray got new orders. The battalions holding the position were going to march out on foot to make room for a massive B-52 strike on the landing zone itself. The bombers were already on their way from Guam, and the target for the third day of bombing was X-ray and the surrounding slopes of the Chu Pong. The troops had to be outside a 2-mile safety zone by mid-morning. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, would march to LZ Columbus, about 2.5 miles to the northeast. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, along with Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry attached to them, would march to a place called LZ Albany, about the same distance to the north-northeast. Captain Forrest didn't like it. His company was being attached to another unit, which meant they'd be bringing up the rear of someone else's column. They'd be following orders from a battalion commander they didn't know, in terrain they hadn't scouted, heading to a landing zone that nobody had properly reconned on the ground. Attached is like being the red-headed stepchild, Forrest later said. But orders were orders. They packed up and moved out. The march to Albany was supposed to be routine, just a tactical movement to a pickup zone where helicopters would extract them. The B-52s were going to pulverize X-ray, and the troops needed to be clear. An aerial reconnaissance of Albany had reported no enemy contact. Jade Warrant Officer Hank Ainsworth had flown his Huey over the clearing earlier that day and seen nothing. Based on that report, Colonel Tim Brown, the brigade commander, had decided to withhold artillery preparatory fires on Albany. The reasoning was that firing artillery would reveal the American movement to the enemy. Better to slip out quietly, reach the landing zone undetected, and extract without a fight. It was a reasonable decision based on the available information. But the available information was wrong. What nobody knew was that 2 battalions of fresh North Vietnamese troops from the 8th Battalion, 66th Regiment, and the 1st Battalion, 33rd Regiment, were resting in the jungle right along the route of march. They had come down from the Chu Pong to reinforce their battered comrades from the X-ray fight. They were tired. They were waiting for orders, and they were about to stumble into a column of American soldiers walking right toward them. The American column stretched out over 500 yards through the jungle. At the head was the reconnaissance platoon of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, followed by Alpha Company 2/7 under Captain Joel Sugdinas, then Delta Company, then Charlie Company under Captain Don Fesmeyer, then Headquarters Company. Bringing up the rear, just as Forrest had feared, was his Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry. The men were tired. They had been fighting for days. They hadn't slept properly. The sun was hot, temperatures in the mid-90s, and the humidity made every step feel like wading through soup. The column moved slowly through the jungle, pushing through undergrowth, stepping over roots and rocks, sweating through their fatigues. Around noon, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade, the battalion commander of 2-7, called a halt near the Albany clearing. The lead element had captured 2 North Vietnamese prisoners near the edge of the clearing, soldiers who had apparently been separated from their unit. McDade called his company commanders forward for a conference to discuss how to proceed. George Forrest started walking up the column with his 2 radio operators, leaving his executive officer, Lieutenant Adams, in charge of the company at the rear. The column was stopped, the men sitting on their packs, taking a break, drinking water, waiting for word on what came next. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the jungle exploded. Mortar rounds came crashing down. Automatic weapons fire erupted from both flanks, from the front, from behind. The North Vietnamese had sprung a classic L-shaped ambush that caught the entire column in a kill zone. The first rounds struck the head of the column, and then the attack rolled down the length of the American formation like a wave of death. Companies C and D took the worst of it. They were in the middle of the column, out in the open, with no cover and enemies on all sides. Within minutes, most of the men in those companies were hit. The NVA soldiers ran down the trail, shooting Americans at point-blank range, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. The tall elephant grass, 3 to 5 feet high, made it impossible to see friend from foe except at extremely close range. Men were shooting at anything that moved, sometimes killing their own comrades in the chaos. The noise was overwhelming, the screaming of the wounded, the crack of rifles, the thump of grenades, the roar of automatic weapons. It was chaos, pure chaos. Captain George Forrest was near the front of the column when the ambush started. He had been walking forward to attend the conference with McDade when the mortars came in. He heard the explosions, saw the chaos erupting around him, felt the bullets snapping past, and he made a decision. He turned and ran. Not away from the fight, but toward his men. His company was at the back of the column, 500 yards or more to the rear. They needed him. They needed their commander. So Forrest sprinted back down the column, covering more than 500 yards through enemy fire. His 2 radio operators ran with him, carrying the heavy PRC-25 radios that were his lifeline to artillery and air support. Both of them were killed during that run, shot down beside him as they ran. Bullets snapped past. Explosions threw dirt into the air. Men were falling all around. American soldiers were dying. North Vietnamese soldiers were charging. And Captain George Forrest kept running. He had to get back to his company. He had to circle the wagons. He had to save as many of his men as he could. Freddie Owens watched it happen. He was at the rear of the column with Alpha 1/5 when the ambush started. He heard the firing up ahead, saw the chaos beginning to ripple back through the formation. And then he saw his captain come running through the middle of that hell, dodging fire, leaping over bodies, pushing toward the rear of the column where Alpha 1/5 was positioned. Owens describes it as one of his most vivid memories of Vietnam. The desperate run of Captain George Forrest right through the middle of an ambush. 500 yards through enemy fire with bullets and explosions all around him. It was the only safe place for me, Forrest later said, because the only safe place on that battlefield was with my men. When Forrest reached his company, he immediately started organizing a defensive perimeter. His men formed a circle, guns facing outward, protecting each other from the enemy swirling around them. Lieutenant Adams had already begun the process of setting up a herringbone defensive formation. Forrest took over and solidified the position. That perimeter held. While the rest of the column was being torn apart, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, held its ground because George Forrest ran that gauntlet and got back to his men. But even with the perimeter holding, men were dying. The enemy was everywhere. Fire was coming from multiple directions. Wounded soldiers were crawling back toward the perimeter, trying to reach safety. Some made it, some didn't. Freddie Owens talks about Vincent Locatelli. Private Vincent Locatelli was 18 years old. He was the baby of the unit, the youngest guy in the company, fresh-faced, eager, probably scared out of his mind like everyone else, but trying not to show it. Owens had this thing in his mind, this thought that if he could just keep Vincent alive, if he could protect the youngest soldier among them, then maybe he could protect the others too. It was irrational, maybe, but war does that to you. You latch onto something, some small thing that feels like it matters, some measure of control, in a situation that is completely out of control. And for Freddie Owens, keeping Vincent Locatelli alive became a kind of talisman. If Vincent makes it, we all make it. If I can save the youngest one, I can save the rest. But war doesn't care about talismans. Vincent Locatelli was killed during the Battle of Ia Drang. He was 18 years old. Freddie Owens felt that loss like a punch to the gut, and he has carried it ever since. Decades later, he still talks about Vincent, still remembers the face, still carries the weight of not being able to save the kid. The fighting at Albany lasted for 16 hours. 16 hours of hell. A 1E Sky Raider aircraft dropped napalm and bombs, but the Americans and North Vietnamese were so intermingled that the airstrikes probably killed soldiers on both sides. The pilots couldn't tell friend from foe. They just dropped their ordnance on concentrations of troops and hoped they were hitting the enemy. Artillery fire was called in, but same problem. The forward observers couldn't get clear fields of fire because the enemy was right on top of the American positions. You couldn't separate friend from foe in that jungle. As darkness fell, the situation was grim. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had been reduced to a small perimeter at the Albany clearing itself, made up of survivors from Alpha Company 27, the recon platoon, and whatever was left of the shattered Charlie and Delta companies. The command group was there, hunkered down, trying to hold on. About 500 to 700 yards south of that, Captain Forrest's Alpha Company 1/5 held their own perimeter. And in between, scattered throughout the jungle and the elephant grass, were wounded Americans. Some were dying, some were dead. Some were still alive but couldn't move, and the North Vietnamese were moving among them in the darkness, killing the wounded, executing the American soldiers who were too hurt to fight back. Around 10 or 11 at night, Captain Forrest was fiddling with his radio when he picked up a weak signal. A voice, barely audible through the static, calling for help. The call sign was Ghost 4-6. That was 2nd Lieutenant Robert Jeanette, the weapons platoon leader from Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. Lieutenant Jeanette was 23 years old, a Bronx kid who had gone to City College of New York and earned his commission through ROTC. He had been in the middle of the column when the ambush hit, and he had been wounded at least 4 times during the fighting, shot in multiple places, unable to walk. But he had held on to his radio, and he kept calling in artillery strikes on groups of North Vietnamese circling the Albany clearing. His call sign was Ghost 46, and he used it throughout the night, directing fire onto the enemy even as he lay bleeding in the elephant grass. Now he was telling Forrest that he was shot up, that he was going to die, that the enemy were crawling around in the grass killing American wounded. He said he could hear them shooting and talking out there around him. He said there were more American wounded in the area who needed help. Captain Forrest wanted to send out a patrol to rescue them. Sergeant Fred Klug, a 32-year-old platoon sergeant from 1st Platoon, Alpha 1 over 5, took it over with the captain. Kluge had been in the Army since 1950. He was 17 when he enlisted, a high school dropout looking for a way out of wherever he came from. He'd fought in Korea with the 187th Regimental Combat Team, one of the Army's elite airborne units. Between the wars, he'd taught map reading and small unit tactics in Army schools. The man knew what he was doing. He was a professional soldier, calm and competent, the kind of NCO that officers relied on when things went bad. And things had gone bad. Kluge laid out the arguments against a night patrol. The whole area was lit up with flares, which cast shifting shadows and made movement dangerous. The enemy was everywhere, crawling through the grass, hunting for wounded Americans. The men Jeanette was calling about were closer to the Albany perimeter than to their position, so it made more sense for the troops at Albany to rescue them. There was no communication with Albany, so coordinating a rescue was impossible. Going out there in the dark seemed like a good way to get more men killed, but the pleas kept coming over the radio. Ghost 46, Lieutenant Jeanette, was describing the enemy moving around, executing American wounded. He could hear them, hear the shots, hear the Vietnamese voices. Every few minutes, Jeanette would fire a single shot from his pistol to guide any rescue party to his position. That became the signal, a gunshot in the darkness every few minutes. "Here I am. Come get me. I'm still alive." Captain Forrest made the call. Despite all the arguments against it, despite the danger, he was sending a patrol. These were American soldiers out there in the grass, wounded and dying, and Forrest wasn't going to leave them. Freddie Owens volunteered to go. Of course he did. These were his brothers. Sergeant Klug led the patrol out into the night, guided by the sound of those gunshots. Moving through that jungle in the darkness, lit by flickering flares that cast strange shadows across everything, must have been one of the most terrifying experiences a soldier could face. Enemy troops were scattered throughout the area, some of them hunting for wounded Americans to kill, others just trying to find their own units in the chaos. American dead and wounded lay in the grass, some of them still, some of them moaning or crying out. You couldn't tell who was friend or foe until you were right on top of them. Every shadow could be a threat. Every sound could be the enemy. Klug led the patrol carefully, cautiously, stepping over bodies, moving through the elephant grass that whispered and rustled with every movement. They followed the sound of Jeanette's signal shots. A crack in the darkness. Pause. Another crack. Getting closer. And eventually, they found them. A small cluster of wounded and desperate Americans huddled together in the darkness, waiting to be either rescued or killed. Klug eased into the position and quietly asked, "Who's in charge here?" There was a long silence, then a faint reply from somewhere nearby. "Over here." It was Lieutenant Jeanette, Ghost 4 to 6. shot up 4 times but still alive, still calling in artillery, still firing signal shots with his pistol. The man thought he had been saved. He had survived the ambush, survived the night, survived the enemy soldiers prowling through the grass, and now his own people had found him. But the rescue wasn't complete yet. There were more wounded who couldn't move, men with shattered legs, men too weak from blood loss to walk. They couldn't all be carried back to the Alpha 1/5 perimeter. Someone had to stay with them through the night, protect them, keep them alive until morning when a proper evacuation could be organized. That's where medic Daniel Torres came in. Specialist 5 Daniel Torres was from El Paso, Texas. He was a combat medic, an aid man, the guy who patched you up when you got hit. In the infantry, the medic is one of the most important men in the unit. He's the one who keeps you alive when you're wounded. He's the one who stops the bleeding, splints the fractures, administers morphine when the pain gets too bad. Medics don't carry as much firepower as the riflemen, but they carry something more important. They carry hope. The knowledge that if you get hit, there's someone who will take care of you. When the patrol found the wounded Americans scattered in the kill zone, Torres made a decision. He volunteered to stay with those who couldn't be moved. He would protect them through the night, give them medical care, keep them alive until morning. Torres armed himself with a machine gun in addition to his medical supplies, an M60, probably taken from a fallen soldier. And he stayed. Alone with the wounded in the darkness, surrounded by enemy soldiers, he stayed. All night long, Daniel Torres sat with those wounded men in the darkness. Enemy soldiers were still moving through the area. Flares cast shifting light across the elephant grass, creating pools of brightness and shadow that moved and changed constantly. The sounds of the dying and the dead surrounded them, men moaning in pain, the distant crack of gunfire, Vietnamese voices somewhere in the darkness. Torres provided what medical care he could with the limited supplies he had: bandages, morphine, pressure on wounds, words of encouragement. He kept the men calm. He kept them quiet so the enemy wouldn't find them. And he was ready to fight if he had to, that M60 machine gun positioned where he could use it if the North Vietnamese came their way. When morning came, more than 40 wounded soldiers were still alive because of what Daniel Torres did that night. Joe Galloway, the war correspondent who was at X-Ray, and later wrote the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young with Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, described Torres as a hero medic. He said Torres kept over 40 wounded soldiers alive and safe through the longest night of their lives. That's not hyperbole. That's just what happened. Freddie Owens was there. He was part of the patrol that found the wounded. He saw what Torres did. He saw the courage it took for that medic to stay behind with men who couldn't move, surrounded by an enemy that was executing American wounded, with nothing but his medical kit and a machine gun to protect them. And Owens has never forgotten it. When he talks about the Ia Drang Valley, when he talks about what Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry went through, the heroism of Daniel Torres is always part of the story. Torres didn't get a Medal of Honor for what he did that night. Maybe he should have. But the men who were there, the men whose lives he saved, they know what he did. And they've spent the rest of their lives telling people about it. By morning on November 18th, reinforcements had arrived. Bravo Company 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry under Captain Buse Tully had marched overland from LZ Columbus, more than 2 miles through the jungle, and linked up with Captain Forrest's perimeter. Together, they pushed forward toward the Albany clearing, driving off the remaining North Vietnamese. They encountered enemy fire as they advanced, fought their way through it, and finally reached the survivors at Albany. Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was helicoptered in to reinforce the survivors at Albany itself. Lieutenant Rick Rescorla, one of the platoon leaders in that company, led his men into the expanded perimeter as the sun came up. The NVA, having taken heavy casualties themselves, began to withdraw. The battle was over, but the cost was staggering. Of the roughly 500 men in the column that marched to LZ Albany on November 17th, 155 were killed and only 84 were able to return to immediate duty. That's a casualty rate of over 50%. Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, suffered 45 dead and more than 50 wounded. 93% of that company sustained some sort of wound or injury. Half of them died. It was the most successful ambush against American forces during the entire Vietnam War. Nothing else came close. The North Vietnamese lost over 400 dead, which was a significant blow to them too. But the American losses, countries concentrated in those few hours of fighting, were devastating. For the men who survived, for the men like Freddie Owens, who walked out of that valley, the scars went far deeper than anything that showed on the surface. The bodies had to be collected. The dead had to be identified. Some were so badly wounded that identification was difficult. Some were missing entirely. 2 soldiers from the Ia Drang battles were never recovered and remain unaccounted for to this day. Captain George Forrest had to write letters to the families of the men who didn't come back. One of those letters was to the mother of a missing soldier. Forrest has talked about how gut-wrenching that was. How do you tell a mother that her son was lost in a jungle on the other side of the world? How do you explain what happened? How do you offer comfort when there's nothing that can make it better? Those letters are part of the burden that officers carry. They're part of the cost of command. Freddie Owens remembers filling out paperwork after the battle. The forms wanted to know about war experiences. Owens says he wrote, "See the information on top," because he couldn't put what happened on paper. He still feels that way. You can't put war on paper, he says. Some people think you can. That's what war does to you. The experiences are too intense, too overwhelming, too far outside the range of normal human experience to be captured in words on a form. You can list the dates and the locations and the unit designations. You can check the boxes for wounds received and decorations earned, but you can't describe what it felt like to watch your friends die. You can't explain the sound of men screaming in pain in the darkness. You can't convey the weight of survivor's guilt that settles on your shoulders and never really goes away. And when people ask why Vietnam veterans look at life the way they do, Owens has an answer. We don't have a choice, he says. We were given a breath of fresh air. For those of us who survived, we sort of relish that time, and when someone asks us about it, we can put it in perspective with what we went through. Not much ever scares you after that. After Ia Drang, the war didn't stop for Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry. While some units went back to play coup for a Thanksgiving dinner, hot food and maybe a moment of rest, Forrest's company went straight to another battle at Bong Son. No rest, no recovery time, just more fighting. The men who had just walked through one of the worst ambushes of the war were immediately thrown into another operation. That's how it was in Vietnam. The war didn't wait for you to heal. The enemy didn't care that you were exhausted and traumatized. There was always another mission, another operation, another hill to take or valley to clear. And you just kept going. Because that's what soldiers do. Freddie Owens served his tour and eventually came home. But coming home was its own kind of battle. He flew into an airport and there was a mob outside. Not a welcoming committee, not grateful citizens thanking him for his service, a mob of protesters. The country had turned against the war, and the men who fought it caught the backlash. They were called baby killers. They were spat on. They were told they should be ashamed of themselves. Owens didn't talk about Vietnam for years. Most of the veterans didn't. They came home, took off their uniforms, and tried to blend back into a society that didn't want to hear what they'd been through. They got jobs, they got married, they raised families, and they kept the war inside, locked away where it couldn't get out and cause trouble. But Owens couldn't leave it completely behind. None of them could. The dreams came, the memories came, the faces of the men who didn't make it came back in quiet moments when there was nothing to distract the mind. You'd be sitting in a chair, watching television, and suddenly you'd be back in the elephant grass with bullets flying and men dying all around you. You'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, soaked in sweat, because you were back at Albany again. The trauma didn't go away just because you stopped talking about it. It just went underground. And Owens found himself reaching out to his fellow veterans. He would talk them through the bad nights. He has talked men out from under the bed in the middle of the night, he says. That's not a figure of speech. The trauma of combat doesn't just go away. It echoes through decades. And sometimes, the only person who can help is someone else who was there. Someone who understands what you went through. Someone who doesn't need it explained. Freddie Owens found his own healing took a strange turn. He was managing, coping, getting by, living his life as best he could, when September 11th, 2001 happened. He watched the Twin Towers fall, and something about that broke through whatever walls he had built up over the years. Watching his country attacked again, watching young people go off to war again, it brought everything back. The emotions, the memories, the anger and the grief and the sense of loss. But it also became a turning point. Owens started talking more openly about his experiences. He started connecting with other veterans more intentionally. He understood that the healing was not complete, and maybe never would be. But that didn't mean he couldn't help others who were struggling. If he could use his own experience to help another veteran get through a rough night, then maybe some good could come out of all that pain. In 2009, Freddie Owens created a Facebook page called We Were Soldiers Once and Young Ia Drang Valley, 1965. The name came from the famous book by Hal Moore and Joe Galloway that told the story of the Ia Drang battles. The book had been published in 1992 and became a bestseller. In 2002, it was made into a movie starring Mel Gibson as Hal Moore. The book and the movie brought the story of Ia Drang to a whole new generation of Americans who had never heard of the battle before. Owens's Facebook page became a gathering place for survivors, for families of those who served, for anyone connected to the 1st Cavalry Division and the Vietnam War. Owens estimates the site averages about 150 hits a day. Around Veterans Day, that number spikes to 400 or more. It's become a place where people can find each other, share memories, ask questions, and honor the men who didn't come back. One of the most remarkable things that happened through that Facebook page involves Daniel Torres. Remember the medic who stayed with the wounded men all night at Albany? Torres had a son named Daniel Torres II, who grew up not knowing the full story of what his father did in Vietnam. Torres Sr. had passed away, taking many of his secrets with him. But Daniel II wanted to know. He wanted to understand who his father was and what he had done. He started searching. He went to a book signing where Joe Galloway was appearing. When Galloway realized who Daniel II was, that this young man was the son of the hero medic from Albany, he signed the book with a tribute to his father. He wrote, "Hero medic of L. Z. Albany. We remember your dad, who kept over 40 wounded soldiers alive and safe through the longest night of their lives. We looked for him for years in the wrong town. Be proud of him, always. That inscription sent Daniel Torres II to the internet, searching for more information. And that search led him to Freddie Owens and the Facebook page. Owens not only knew Daniel Torres Sr., he had been there at Albany. He had been part of the patrol that found the wounded. He knew the secrets. He could fill in the blanks that the son had wondered about his whole life. That connection, made possible by a Facebook page started by a Vietnam veteran who just wanted to help, changed Daniel Torres II's understanding of his father. It gave him the full picture of who his father was and what he had done. And it happened because Freddie Owens never stopped carrying the men he served with in his heart. The Ia Drang alumni hold reunions. They meet every year before Veterans Day in Washington, and again wherever the 1st Cavalry Division Association holds its summer gathering. They call the roll. First, they read the names of all those who fell in the valley and all those who have joined them since. Then, one by one, the living survivors stand to call out their own names, their ranks, their companies and battalions, and where they fought. There are no dues, someone once said. Those were paid in blood long ago. There are no officers, just brothers. Men who went through something together that bound them for life. Freddie Owens attends those reunions when he can, and he talks about what it's like to see the families of the men who survived. He looks at them, and he sees echoes. He sees the men he knew in 1965 reflected in their children and grandchildren. He says there was a soldier named L. May, one of the guys from his unit, who wasn't killed in the Ia Drang. The first time Owens saw L. May's daughter at a reunion, she stepped out of an RV and it was like looking into his face. She was the spitting image of her father. The spitting image. Owens has seen S. Rogers' great-grandson, standing there at Murphy's birthday gathering. Spitting image of S. Rogers. He can go on down the line. These young people, they carry the faces of the men Owens served with, the men who survived and the men who didn't. And when Owens tries to describe what that feels like, the words don't come fast enough. That's what he says. Words can't come fast enough to describe what I have to feel inside. Because of the sacrifices, because of what those men gave, because of what it cost them and what it cost the families they left behind. The weight of all that, it's always there. It doesn't get lighter with time. If anything, it gets heavier as you get older and you understand more fully what was lost. Freddie Owens has given interviews. He has recorded his memories with the Witness to War Foundation, an organization dedicated to preserving the stories of combat veterans so that future generations can hear them directly from the men who were there. He has talked about the men who served under him and alongside him. He has praised Captain George Forrest as a hero who saved Alpha Company by making that impossible run through enemy fire. He has honored the memory of Daniel Torres and Fred Kluge and all the others who did extraordinary things in ordinary moments. He has mourned Vincent Locatelli, the 18-year-old kid he couldn't save. And he has tried, in his own way, to make sure that what happened in the Ia Drang Valley is not forgotten. The Battle of Ia Drang changed the Vietnam War. It showed the American military that the North Vietnamese Army was willing and able to stand and fight major engagements. The NVA wasn't just going to melt away into the jungle like the Viet Cong guerrillas. They would meet American troops head-on, take massive casualties, and keep coming. The battle proved that helicopter-borne infantry could operate effectively in remote terrain. It demonstrated the awesome destructive power of American artillery and air support. But it also taught the NVA a valuable lesson. They learned that if they engaged American troops at close quarters, hugging the belts of the GIs, the Americans couldn't use their firepower without killing their own men. That tactic would define the war for the next decade. Every strategy has a counter-strategy. Every advantage has a cost. The men who fought at X-Ray and Albany, they didn't have the luxury of analyzing tactics and strategy. They were just trying to survive. They were watching their friends die. They were doing whatever it took to get through the next hour, the next minute, the next second. And when it was over, when the helicopters finally lifted them out and the B-52s turned the valley into a moonscape, they had to figure out how to keep living with what they had seen and done. Freddie Owens figured it out, one day at a time. He came home. He built a life. He stayed connected to his brothers from the war. He helped others when they needed it. He created a community online for people connected to the Ia Drang. He talked about his experiences even when talking about them hurt, because he understood that if the stories aren't told, they get forgotten. And the men who died deserve better than that. They deserve to be remembered. When Owens looks back on the devastation of Ia Drang, he sees something complicated. He sees the horror, yes, the death, the loss, the friends who never came home. But he also sees something else when he looks at the surviving families. He sees the children and grandchildren of the men he served with. He sees the continuation of something, the genetic echoes of his brothers in arms walking around in the world, living their lives, carrying forward what their fathers and grandfathers started. And that gives him something to hold on to. It makes the sacrifice mean something. It connects the past to the future in a way that honors what was given. You know, I think about what Freddie Owens said about not being able to put war on paper. He's right. You can write down the dates and the unit designations and the casualty figures. You can describe the terrain and the weather and the weapons. You can quote the after-action reports. But you can't capture what it feels like to be 19 years old in the tall grass with bullets flying and your friends dying around you. You can't convey the weight of survivor's guilt that sits on a man's chest for the rest of his life. You can't explain how a medic with a machine gun kept 40 wounded soldiers alive through the longest night of their lives by sheer force of will and love and duty. But we can try. We can listen to the men who were there. We can honor their stories. We can remember the names of the fallen and the faces of the survivors. We can teach our children what happened and why it mattered. And we can thank the men like Freddie Owens who carry the burden of memory so that the rest of us don't forget. Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. Those weren't just words on a unit roster. That was a group of young Americans who went to a place called Vietnam and fought in a valley called Ia Drang and lived through one of the worst ambushes of the entire war. Some of them didn't make it. Vincent Locatelli didn't make it. He was 18 years old. Others were wounded, changed forever by what happened in those 16 hours of hell. And some, like Freddie Owens, walk out of that valley and spent the next 60 years carrying the memory of the men who didn't. The war ended a long time ago. The names are carved on a black granite wall in Washington. The reunions get smaller every year as the survivors age and pass on. But the story doesn't end. It lives in the words of the men who were there. It lives in the families who carry the legacy forward. It lives in the effort to remember, to honor, to never let the sacrifice be forgotten. Freddie Owens has done his part. He has told his story. He has kept the memories alive. He has connected families with the truth about their fathers and grandfathers. He has helped his brothers through the dark nights when the dreams come back. And he has shown us what it means to carry a burden with dignity and grace, even when the weight of it never gets lighter. However you look at it, what those men did in the Ia Drang Valley in November of 1965 mattered. It mattered then, It matters now. It will matter as long as there are people willing to listen and remember. Stories like this don't always get told the right way, if they get told at all. But Freddie Owens made sure this one did. And because of him, because of his willingness to share the hardest memories of his life, we can understand a little bit better what those young soldiers went through, what they gave, what they lost, and why they deserve to be remembered. When you really sit with it, it's hard not to respect what people like Freddie Owens went through. And it's hard not to be grateful that they've been willing to tell us about it.